Signed, sealed, and delivered, some with 5 stars, some with 4, some with 3, and on down the line. This is ACC Breakdown on a National Signing Day 2016. I'm Mark Rogers of Mark Rogers TV. We do this every Wednesday night talking ACC football at 8 o'clock Eastern Time. We bring in this week Mike McDaniel from inside the ACC and also Joey Weaver from the Rumble seat to talk up ACC football. And this is the day that there are no games played, but it might be the most important day of the year. And lo and behold, Florida State wraps up another ACC championship game or ACC championship in the offseason with another top recruiting class. Joey, your thoughts about the cream of the crop in the ACC? Clemson coming off the championship, Miami with Mark Richt in the fold making some moves as well.
Yeah, like you said, I mean, National Signing Day has really become something of a spectacle amongst a lot of college football fans, and I think, you know, from the outside looking in, if you were a non-college football person kind of watching all the hubbub around the whole thing, it looks absolutely ridiculous. But it is what it is. You know, we are who we are, and we love this stuff. So you're right, Florida State pulled it off. Once again, best recruiting class in the ACC. Not sure that that's really a big shock. By rivals, they had the number 2 class in the country as of the time that this is being recorded. And so I think it just continues the excellent work that Jimbo Fisher is doing down there in Tallahassee, pulling in talented kids on top of talented kids, and it seems like that whole dynasty that they've been building over the last few years really isn't going anywhere in the near future. I think maybe one of the more impressive efforts, like you said, was Clemson, who on Rivals is currently listed at number 5. For them, they've traditionally under Dabo Swinney recruited fairly well, not quite top 5 level though, and so for him to pull together this class was pretty impressive. I know today Rashawn Gary, top prospect in the country, defensive tackle. A lot of people had thought he was going to Michigan, but there was kind of becoming this thought that he may end up at Clemson. So the fact that they were even in that discussion this late in the game, I think really speaks to how well that they're recruiting there. Now we did over it from the Rumble seat. We had a couple of conversations this past week where a couple of Clemson fans dropped in. They were talking about kind of the only thing maybe keeping them from going to the next level. It seems like there's some frustrations maybe with some lower end commitments that they're taking due to family commitments and ties. Not so much because they're particularly worthy players, but because Dabo played with one of their dad or something like this, to where a couple of those things are happening. So just something to keep an eye on in future years as we keep watching Clemson try to build and maintain the success that they've got. One of the things I said I was watching too last week was how Mark Richt finished out his first class in Miami. Like we said, it's only been a couple months that he's been down there, and so what was he able to salvage and then pull together? Thought they did a fairly good job. I know from my perspective, they took a commit from Georgia Tech last night. It's not that he was committed anywhere, but it came down to Georgia Tech in Miami. That was with 4-star safety Romeo Finley, and he ended up with Miami, where he was kind of a childhood fan, but really wasn't something where Miami was in the game early on. He kind of took a last-minute visit down there, and apparently it sold him enough to where he ended up down there. So a nice job for Mark Richt finishing out his first recruiting class at Miami. At the moment, Rivals has them at number 21, so right outside the top 20, but certainly another good class. And then the only other one that I'll mention, being my other fanhood beyond Georgia Tech, is Louisville. I think there was a little bit of turbulence here down the stretch where they had some local players and some longtime commits that kind of were flipped to go to elsewhere. I know one of them, the defensive back, ended up at Ohio State. Balin Buchanan, who was son of Ray Buchanan, another guy that Georgia Tech was actually interested in, he decommitted back in December, and then shortly afterwards ended up at Tennessee. But that said, they also brought in a couple of good guys here towards the end. So kind of a nice job to save face here at the end for Bobby Petrino, but certainly could have been a little better if they were to hold on to recruits from throughout the process a little better.
Yeah, Louisville bunched up at 36, 37, and 38 according to ESPN 24/7 and Rivals. You mentioned that Florida State class at number 1 as it currently stands according to ESPN, number 2 for Rivals and 24/7. What's impressive about this Florida State class? 19 4- and 5-star athletes out of 25 commits, and they really were bolstered and made that jump 4 or 5 spots in the rankings today based on three guys on the fence that went their way. The 11th ranked offensive tackle in the nation, Jawan Williams, chose Florida State earlier today. Also, the 10th rated defensive tackle, Shavar Manuel, did a flip from Florida to Florida State. And also a huge commit in Landon Dickerson, the 5th rated offensive tackle who was considering Alabama, Tennessee. He had the helmets lined up this morning. He went with Florida State. So Jimbo Fisher, a closer on this day, on National Signing Day, to possibly bring in the best haul in the nation. Mike, your thoughts about the cream of the crop and just whatever else caught your eye?
Yeah, so I think with Florida State, the one big surprise was, well, I mean, not a huge surprise, but the one surprise I saw, obviously, Jawan Williams, like you just mentioned, but the fact that they were able to flip Shavar Manuel and also gain a commitment from Keith Gavin a couple nights ago, 6'3" wide receiver, target out Crawfordville, Florida. That was huge for them because, you know, Gavin had committed to Florida State last year, and then it was to a point in time where he decided to reopen his commitment, and he was being recruited highly, and you know, Alabama was real hot on the trail for him, and he ends up sticking originally to his commitment with Florida State, which was huge. He was instrumental from all indications in recruiting some other guys to stay with Florida State, even though, you know, some of these guys, and in Florida State's case, most of the guys in their class, you know, are ranked so highly and thought of so highly by many schools across the country that, you know, they're in a situation where they're being recruited by many coaches and many teams that are just as good as Florida State. So for Florida State to keep Keith Gavin on board and also sign defensive end Brian Burns this afternoon, that was huge for them. 6'5", 217-pound defensive end. He'll provide a good depth option for them initially, and he's a guy that'll step in the next couple seasons in a starting role and really produce for them. But, you know, it's ho-hum for Florida State with Jimbo Fisher. I mean, I feel like at this point he's batting about 1,000. You know, they've been the #1 class in the ACC every year since he took over as head coach in 2010, and they've had a top class since he's been on the staff in the late 2000s. So when you look at their successes they've had, it's not a huge surprise that they were #1 class in the ACC. But I think to make that jump and get the guys that they got today, they were kind of on the fence about coming to Florida State. Says a lot about Jimbo Fisher and his ability with his staff for them to close on some of these recruits that were so highly thought of. And, you know, Florida State, for them to rival Alabama as one of the top classes in the nation, says a lot about where this program is heading. As for Clemson, you know, Joey said a lot about them, but, you know, getting Trey Lamar, Dexter Lawrence, and Rashawn Smith is a cornerstone of your recruiting class. I mean, you get three five-star defensive players according to Rivals, and they made a real run at Rashawn Gary last weekend, and by all indications it was a very close decision there for Gary, the #1 defensive tackle and #1 overall player by nearly every recruiting service you looked at. He ended up sticking with his original commitment with Michigan. I guess he hadn't necessarily chosen Michigan up until today, but he was a guy that was heavily interested in the Wolverines, and Jim Harbaugh did a great job recruiting him. And by all indications, up until this past week, it looked like Michigan was it was a shoo-in, that he was going to end up there come National Signing Day, and he eventually did. But Dabo Swinney and his staff made a huge run at him last weekend on his official visit there to Clemson. So it just says a lot about Dabo Swinney. And I guess coming off of a national championship appearance, it's not too hard to commit or to recruit to the success of your program. And as far as Miami's concerned, a smaller class by their standards, but to still have a top 25 recruiting class for the first-year head coach, I think is huge, especially considering when Mark Richt came in. It's really only been a month and a half since he took over as head coach, and the big guy they got today was 6'2" wide receiver target Amon Richards out of Wellington, Florida. They were working really hard to keep him in state. He was looking at Florida State as well. University of Georgia was pushing hard for him. There were a lot of schools that really wanted his services, and that was kind of the gem of the class that they got today. A big-time player, real speedster, and a guy that they think can make a difference on the outside immediately there for Miami, and Brad Kaya, who, you know, has had guys to throw to here in the past, but Amon Richards will be right up there heading into next season and on down the line. So, I mean, those three schools clearly have separated themselves in the ACC, but I think we'll talk about some schools here in a couple of minutes that we're also impressed with, but I think it's far and away, you know, Florida State and Clemson, and then Miami is not far behind, and then there's a little bit of a drop-off, but the ACC is definitely improving on the recruiting trail.
ACC Breakdown every Wednesday night at 8 o'clock Eastern Time. We got Joey Weaver on the line and Mike McDaniel as well. Guys, to give the conference a little context here, 8 teams out of the 14 in the top 40, according to ESPN. I think there's a distinction here, and the kudos to Pitt. Joey touched upon it in the top 30 after like a class rank of, I believe you said, Joey, 65 last year, according to Rivals. Duke has really made strides under David Cutcliffe. He used to coach him up, and now he's got a little bit more talent to coach up, according to this class that ranks anywhere between 28 and 33, according to 3 of the major services. But the distinction that I see in lining up these classes, and this is no great mystery here, is that while Duke and Pitt, Virginia Tech, North Carolina have the type classes we expect, Louisville, throw them in there as well, Florida State, Clemson, Miami, they bring in the elite of the elite. Florida State, 16 ESPN 300 players, Clemson 11, Miami 10, and then it plummets after that. Really, the high 4s, the 5s go to those 3 schools this year. Joey, do you think that's a little disconcerting for the entire conference perspective?
You know, I look at it, and first of all, it seems like it's kind of business as usual for those 2 schools in the Atlantic. I mean, they're the 2 schools that have basically run the Atlantic Division for the better part of a decade now, both from a talent standpoint as well as from a winning standpoint. I think, I mean, I can't even remember who the last team was from the Atlantic Division other than those 2 to play in Charlotte. It may be Boston College under Matt Ryan or something like that. But in any case, you know, I think that it kind of just maintains the balance of power, kind of what you've seen. I mean, those 2 have been the front runners for the ACC as consistently as anybody else has across the conference for the last several years. The Miami thing, it is another continuation of a trend I think that we've seen where they've typically recruited very, very well. They are in a good area, pulling a lot of talent, a good state, as well as just a good city from a raw talent standpoint. The question is whether Mark Richt can develop talent a little better than both Randy Shannon and Al Golden did. And before, you know, Miami fans, I think there's been a couple of them I've seen that got very excited, like, oh, now we finally got a coach that can develop talent. Well, then again, that's also kind of the thing that got Mark Richt run out of Athens by Georgia fans. So just careful with that one before you go too crazy with it. But you know, again, I think it's about the same. But to see schools like Pittsburgh, like he's mentioned, Duke, Louisville, other guys that are getting into this top 40 and kind of maybe pulling in towards that same talent range, I think it's going to create a lot more parity than maybe we're used to seeing, which is maybe saying something considering we're talking about the ACC here. But at the same time, I don't expect to see a whole bunch of changes regarding who is really kind of the most powerful programs in the conference. I think that obviously sticks with Florida State and Clemson, and kind of what we saw today and over the last few months with this recruiting cycle only just continues to confirm that.
There are very few programs across the country that can just, regardless of who's coaching, just the brand name draws recruits. Fill in the blanks: USC, Ohio State, Alabama, Florida State, Clemson. You can't even put in that category. Clemson churning out 7 and 5 seasons when they didn't have the right coach in place. So my question here, Mike, is that Virginia Tech, I'm going to go right into your wheelhouse with the Hokies, because we're looking at a program that for the first time in forever, there's no Frank Beamer on the scene. This program could be what it's been for about 15 years, where it was challenging for top 10 finishes and going to major bowl games, or it could just be another NC State, basically. That's the range for, and we've seen it again. We assume Clemson's going to ride this forever, but Clemson hasn't always been that, and Virginia Tech could be a pretty marginal program unless Justin Fuente does something different that Frank Beamer wasn't able to do in recent years. So your reaction to the recruiting efforts there?
Well, I think with Virginia Tech today, it was a lot of kind of what was expected. A lot of guys that they were real solid on, a lot of guys that were really sold on the program, they ended up signing. And a lot of guys that were on the fence, who were kind of up in the air, weren't so sure about Justin Fuente and the program. With him coming in just about 2 months ago, they didn't sign. And I think that's not really a negative reflection on Justin Fuente. I think the one positive that you have to take away from this is that Fuente was able to keep a bunch of the blue-chip recruits. As far as Virginia Tech was concerned, they had a lot of 4-star receivers. They got a 4-star JUCO quarterback transfer, Gerard Evans, who ended up signing with the Hokies. He's already on campus. He's been signed for a couple of weeks now. So I think what happened with Justin Fuente and the Hokies is just the fact that he has not been at the school that long, so guys that were on the fence weren't going to end up signing there. From an offensive line standpoint, Dylan Powell was the guy. He was a 3-star offensive lineman out of Missouri. He ended up signing with Stanford the other night, a guy that the Hokies were really hoping to get just because it would have been a nice depth piece on the line there. Because, look, Virginia Tech's offensive line, we've seen over the last couple seasons, they've struggled to protect their quarterbacks. I mean, it was the chief reason why Michael Brewer missed most of the season this past year is because he got drilled in the Ohio State game. They couldn't really protect him, and Brendan Motley came in. He was running for his life. So offensive line has been an issue for quite some time now. So to lose Dylan Powell out of state, and then you look at the rest of the guys that they've brought in, they do have some offensive line talent. Silas Zanzi, he's a 2-star recruit, but he's highly thought of in my area of Virginia, in the Woodbridge area, Northern Virginia area, and he's a guy that can come in and contribute. They have T.J. Jackson and Patrick Kearns, two very highly thought of offensive linemen. They're 3 or 4-star recruits, depending on which recruiting database you look at, and they're guys that can come in and contribute as well. So I think the offensive line for Virginia Tech will be fine, but I think the biggest blow that was dealt to the Hokies here on National Signing Day is the fact that this news just broke a little while ago. They're losing defensive back coach Torian Gray to the University of Florida, and Torian Gray is a guy that has coached Kendall and Kyle Fuller. He's coached Cam Chancellor, who's a perennial Pro Bowler in the NFL for the Seattle Seahawks. And he's been a big reason why Virginia Tech's defensive backs have done so well, not only in college, but making the step up to the next level. So for him to go to Florida, I understand that that Justin Fuente wanted to keep him on the staff there at Virginia Tech, but when push came to shove, they actually made him take a pay cut to stay on the staff. So if you're Torian Gray and you're looking around and there's a school in your home state of Florida that's going to extend you an offer for what I assume would be a raise now, the terms of the deal have not been disclosed yet, but I would assume it's a raise to what he's being paid now at Virginia Tech, and he's one of the more highly thought of defensive back coaches in the profession. It's a huge blow to Virginia Tech, and that's the one thing that's really going to hurt them moving forward. It's not the guys that they necessarily didn't get as far as players are concerned, but the fact that they lost one of their top coaches from their staff over the last couple seasons, and he's heading not only out of Virginia Tech but out of the ACC as a whole. So not a great day for Virginia Tech, but they were able to keep a lot of the guys that they were real solid on. So I guess it went about as expected, other than the unexpected news with Torian Gray.
So Virginia Tech at 38, 41, and 49 by the 3 services we cited earlier, ESPN, Rivals, and 24/7. Joey, before I catch your ire, stay with me for just a second here. 2 years ago, Georgia Tech wins the Orange Bowl, finishes in the top 10. They come off a 3-9 season. They're ranked at 55 and 66 according to 24/7 and Rivals. So the treetop look at the program would be downhill slide, decline, just based on that. That may not be the true story. So are you disappointed?
Man, give me the tough questions. So you're right. It was, we look at where we were a little over 365 days ago, coming off an Orange Bowl win. Huge win for the program. It had a lot of fans very excited. Go through the month of January last year into National Signing Day, and they had a lot of momentum in the recruiting game, and things were really looking up. And then this season happened. It was kind of a worst case scenario where everything that could go wrong did go wrong. And yet I thought the coaches kind of salvaged and did fairly well for themselves in January. They entered the month with only 12 commitments. They finished today with 18. That's kind of one of those scholarship number things. It's not so much that they only found 18 kids that wanted to play for them. It was just that's the way that the numbers kind of worked out. And so I think that's a little bit of where you're getting penalized on a couple of those sites. They also had they had a few kids I thought that were rated maybe a little lower than they should have been. But that's kind of neither here nor there. So am I disappointed? Not really. There were several prospects that were pretty high on the priority list in the month of January that they ended up going to get. They had 4 commitments, like I said, a little over a week ago, in a span of about 36 hours. 3 of those were flipped from long-term commitments to schools that were in these players' hometowns. They got a defensive tackle from Nashville who was committed to Vanderbilt. That was very much needed. They got a quarterback from San Diego who was committed to San Diego State. That was very much needed. A lot of people really like him. There was also an offensive lineman from Louisiana who was committed to Louisiana Lafayette. He should provide some good depth in that position. And so They brought in some guys like that. They also brought in Jordan Woods, who is a upper 3-star, low 4-star defensive end. He was all but gone to Tennessee when they brought him in. I think that was a huge, huge pickup for the staff. And so there was a little bit of a stumble here towards the end. On Tuesday, they had 2 top recruits, like I mentioned before, Finley, as well as Donovan Campbell, 4-star offensive lineman who was committed to LSU. The hope was that they could get at least one of them. They ended up getting neither. That certainly hurts. Doesn't feel good. But it's also kind of consoling to know that they were very much in the thick of it this late in the game. I think that was a little bit of a change from what we're used to seeing from Georgia Tech. And so it could have gone better. Absolutely, it could have. And there were several other prospects kind of along the way that kind of faltered here or there. But all things considered, the fact that they came off of this 3-9 season and everybody had reasons to kind of write them off entirely, they still did a fairly good job in the month of January. Certainly, I think one of the better jobs you could have asked for. And it's probably worth mentioning too that they are still in the game for perhaps the top uncommitted player in the country. That's 5-star athlete Demetrius Robertson. There's a little bit of a long story here. Basically, he really wants to go to Stanford. To be able to do that, he had to raise his SAT score by something like 100 points. He took that SAT again a few weekends back, so he's currently awaiting a score. If he gets that score and he gets into Stanford, it looks like that's a done deal, no questions asked, he's going to Stanford. If he doesn't, it becomes a 3-horse race between Notre Dame, Georgia, and Georgia Tech, most likely. All the signs kind of point to him having eliminated Alabama at this point. And then there were some rumblings in the last couple of days that Notre Dame had told Robertson, well, if you don't sign on Wednesday, we're pulling your offer. Is that legit? Is that just kind of a sales tactic? I don't really know. But point being, you very well could end up down to a 2-school race for Robertson, someone who has developed a good relationship with Paul Johnson, was on a visit the last weekend before signing day and was pretty impressed with the campus from what I can tell. And so you still have the opportunity to not only put a little bit of a gem there towards the end, but sign your first 5-star recruit in program history, since we've been talking about recruiting rankings for the last decade and a half now. So the opportunity is there to, again, kind of add a little bit of polish there on the end and add a kid that should be very helpful and get some momentum going back in the right way. As far as what they've done already, though, I'm not super impressed, but I'm not disappointed, I wouldn't say. I think they did a fairly good job, all things considered, from where they started, just a couple months ago to where they finished up today. So that's how I would grade it, at least.
Yeah, and again, great classes from Florida State and Clemson, 8 top 40 classes, and it's a league that going into the off season now brings in 2 top coaches from out of the conference, and Mark Richt and Justin Fuente. And if you look at the quarterbacks coming back, really just Jacoby Brissett and Marquise Williams at North Carolina State and North Carolina, respectively, are the only 2 major quarterbacks from contending teams from last year that will be missing pieces in 2016. So from that standpoint, a coaching standpoint, quarterback standpoint that you typically build a franchise with, the ACC seems to be in good shape. Mike, anything we missed?
Yeah, there are just actually a couple schools I want to build a little bit off of, kind of what Joey was saying. I want to talk about Pittsburgh here for a second, because Pittsburgh was a school coming into this recruiting cycle. We thought they would take a step up from where they were last year with Pat Narduzzi and how he recruited defensive talent at Michigan State as a defensive coordinator. We expected him to come in his first full cycle at Pittsburgh and do a pretty good job, but what he ended up doing was probably more than I imagined anyway. Maybe I sold him a little bit short. But either way, coming in and signing DeMar Hamlin the other night, he's a 4-star defensive back right out of nearby Pittsburgh. He's a guy who comes from a local high school. He was being heavily recruited by Penn State and Ohio State, but instead he's going to stay right there near his hometown and play football at the University of Pittsburgh. It seemed like a no-brainer for him, he said, but that's a huge get for them. They signed 5 4-star recruits, according to Rivals, and 4 of them are projected to be on the defensive side of the football. Amir Watts is probably the most highly touted. He's a 6'3" defensive tackle. They have 6'1", 203-pound linebacker Kazon Pugh out of Aliquippa, Pennsylvania, another guy that is expected to come in and stay in state and play very well for them. And George Hill, he's an athlete. He projects either as a defensive back or a wide receiver. 6 foot, 185, made a lot of plays in high school on both sides of the football, and they're hoping he can contribute one way or another. And kind of underrated on the offensive side of the football, 2 nights ago on Monday, they signed Aaron Matthews, who was originally committed to Penn State. They were able to get a flip out of him. He's a 3-star athlete. He projects as a receiver, 6'4", 188-pound target that really was a guy that helped wrap up this recruiting class for Pittsburgh, and it was a very successful one for Pat Narduzzi, especially on the defensive side of the football. So I was really impressed with what they were able to do. North Carolina, look, Larry Fedora has rebuilt that program. I think that's pretty clear. But the guys he was able to bring in, especially 4-star defensive end Tamon Fox, he was relatively solid on his commitment to North Carolina, but he was being pretty highly recruited by Virginia Tech as well here down the stretch. He visited Blacksburg this past weekend on his official visit. His teammate Emmanuel Belmar ended up signing with the Hokies this morning. They were trying to get him to flip. He ended up staying with North Carolina. That's a huge get for them at defensive end because we know the talent that North Carolina has on offense, but if there's one side of the football they need to improve on, it's on defense. And signing Patrick Rene, a 6'2" defensive back out of Alexandria, Virginia, adding Tamon Fox, and then also signing 4-star defensive back Miles Doran for this recruiting class, I think it's going to be huge for them. And they really made it a priority to improve on the defensive side of the football this past season, and I think they'll be making another step in the right direction with the talent they're bringing in as far as that's concerned. And one other team I've been watching, I actually said on the radio yesterday, local radio in Blacksburg, it's a school that I really wanted to watch coming into today, and they didn't perform quite as well as I thought they might. I made a bold prediction they'd finish with a top 5 class in the ACC. They performed as expected, but what ended up happening was schools like North Carolina and Pittsburgh finished so strong that they kind of finished a little bit behind them, and that's NC State. Signing tight end Thaddeus Moss, the 4-star tight end, son of Randy Moss, that was a huge get for them considering they had 40% of their targets last year to tight ends. So you're adding another guy on the offensive side of the football that can catch the ball at the tight end position. I think that's huge for them. He's drawing comparisons to Rob Gronkowski, who's a huge target. Mark, I know you and I talked about him in a couple other recruiting videos, but that was a good get for them. And then signing 4-star receiver Kelvin Harmon. Listen, this guy's out of Palmyra, New Jersey. They weren't sure if he was going to play receiver, if he was going to project to more of a defensive back at the next level, but he's a pretty big guy. He's 6'3", 195 pounds. He's listed as an athlete by ESPN, as a wide receiver by Rivals. He's a fringe 4-star or upper tier 3-star recruit, and he's the guy that's going to come in and really make a difference for NC State. They're going to be able to pair him on the outside with the young receivers they already have in place, and he's going to be a guy that I think can make a lot of plays for them. And NC State, look, they have 27 commits, and that's one of the biggest classes in the ACC, if not the biggest class. A lot of 3-stars and lower tier 4-stars mixing in there, and I think that they're a school that's going to make a lot of noise in the ACC in the coming years because of the solid foundation that Dave Doran and that coaching staff has put together there at NC State that's flying under the radar a little bit. So those are the 3 schools that I came away from National Signing Day really impressed with.
Great work, guys. You make this show go. I just sit here and kind of point you in the right direction and let you go. ACC Breakdown every Wednesday night. We talk up the ACC. It's football nonstop, 52 weeks a year. Mike McDaniel from inside the ACC, Joey Weaver from the Rumble seat, and a cast of thousands throughout the year. So, guys, appreciate it. National Signing Day kind of in the books. Joey, you will actually hit upon a good point in regards to that 5-star that's still out there. People are going to look at those recruiting rankings at the end of the business day today, close the book on it, and go ahead. And there's still some guys loose out there that are running around that are going to commit, and they are actually, there are some storylines out there yet to be solved at this point. So appreciate the time. Again, Joey Weaver, Mike McDaniel, it's inside. He's got Inside the ACC. This is ACC Breakdown every Wednesday night. All right, guys, thanks a lot.
Thanks, Mark.
Appreciate it, Mark.